The air at the livestock auction was thick with the scent of dust, sweat, and cheap cigars. It was a place of endings, where lives were measured in pounds and priced by the pound. On this blistering afternoon, one ending seemed particularly brutal and foregone. In the center of the ring, a creature of pure distilled fury slammed against the steel bars of his pen. He was a Charolais bull, a mountain of muscle the color of old ivory, but his spirit was the color of blood and thunder. They called him Kaiser. His eyes, small and black in his massive head, were not just angry. They were burning with a desperate, terrifying fire. He had gored 2 farmhands, shattered a reinforced gate, and was deemed so dangerous, so utterly broken, that the auctioneer started the bidding not with a price, but with a warning. This wasn't a sale, it was a disposal. The starting bid was a formality, a joke laced with grim reality. $1. A single dollar for a ton of violent despair. Laughter, sharp and dismissive, rippled through the crowd of weathered farmers. $1 for a one-way trip to the slaughterhouse. It was the only trip this bull was ever going to make. But then, from the back, a voice, raspy with age, cut through the noise. $1. The crowd turned. There stood Arthur, a man who looked as though he'd been carved from the same dry earth as the fields he once plowed. His back was bent, his hands were gnarled with arthritis, and his face was a roadmap of 80 years of hard sun and quiet sorrow. The other farmers exchanged glances. Old Arthur, cranky, solitary Arthur, who hadn't bought an animal in a decade, who mostly kept to himself since his wife Martha had passed. What on earth did he want with a monster? The auctioneer, surprised, squinted. Sold, he barked, slamming his gavel with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. For $1. To the man with a death wish. A wave of uneasy murmurs followed Arthur as he hobbled to the office to sign the papers. He was buying a broken thing, a creature everyone else had thrown away. He was buying a problem for the price of a candy bar. But as he signed his name, his hands steady, he wasn't thinking about the danger. He was thinking about the look in the bull's eyes. It wasn't just rage. Beneath the fire, he had seen something else. Something he recognized with a deep and painful clarity. The profound, soul-crushing terror of being utterly alone. The journey home was a symphony of violence. Inside the rattling steel trailer, Kaiser was not an animal. He was a storm. He kicked the walls with thunderous blows that made the entire truck shudder. He bellowed, a ragged, raw sound of pure panic that vibrated through the floorboards and up Arthur's spine. Anyone else would have driven faster, eager to unload the terror, to get it behind a strong fence and bolt the gate. But Arthur drove slowly, his gnarled hands gentle on the wheel. He didn't curse or shout. He didn't react to the chaos erupting just a few feet behind his head. When he finally pulled into his long, overgrown driveway, he didn't rush to the back of the trailer. He simply shut off the engine. The sudden silence was more deafening than the noise had been. The only sounds were the frantic, heaving breaths of the bull and the whisper of wind through the tall, unkempt grass of Arthur's fields. He sat there for a long time, letting the quiet settle. He could feel the bull's fear radiating like heat from an oven. Finally, he climbed out of the truck, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't carry a prod or a whip. He walked to the back of the trailer and stood there, not opening the latch, just being present. "Easy now, son," he said, his voice soft, a low murmur that was almost lost in the breeze. "You're home. No one's going to hurt you here," Kaiser responded with a furious snort, a blast of hot air that fogged the metal slats. A hoof slammed against the door, making Arthur flinch, but he didn't move away. He just stood there, a frail silhouette against the vast, empty sky. He stayed until the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of lavender and rose. He spoke to the bull, not with commands, but with stories. He talked about the weather, about the stubborn weeds in his garden, about a bird he'd seen that morning. He told the bull his name was Arthur. And then, as the first stars began to prick the deepening twilight, he unlatched the trailer door, swung it wide open, and walked away, leaving the path to the pasture clear. He didn't watch. He didn't wait. He simply trusted, offering freedom instead of force, an invitation instead of an order. For a full hour, nothing happened. Then, a dark, massive shape emerged tentatively from the trailer, stepping onto the soft earth as if it were glass. The fence line became their sanctuary, their silent meeting place. Every morning, just as the sun bled over the eastern hills, Arthur would emerge from his small, quiet farmhouse. In one hand, he carried his worn wooden stool. In the other, a metal bucket. He would walk to the edge of the pasture, place his stool just outside the wire fence, and sit. Inside, Kaiser was a ghost of his former rage. He no longer charged the fence, but paced it relentlessly, a heavy, rhythmic tread that wore a dark path in the damp earth. His head was always low, his powerful shoulders tense, a coiled spring of mistrust. He watched Arthur with those dark, intelligent eyes, waiting for the trick, the sudden movement, the inevitable betrayal that his life had taught him was all humans offered. But Arthur offered none of it. He would sit on his stool for an hour, sometimes two, and he would talk. He never raised his voice. He spoke of Martha, his late wife, of the songs she used to sing while baking bread, the scent of cinnamon and yeast filling their small home. He'd hum one of those songs, a simple, wavering tune that the wind seemed to carry across the wire barrier between them. "She'd have liked you," Arthur said one morning, his voice thick with memory. "She always had a soft spot for the stubborn ones." He never tried to get closer. The fence was their agreed-upon boundary, a symbol of the chasm of fear and pain that separated them. In the bucket wasn't just feed. Tucked among the grains were treasures: a crisp, red apple, a sweet carrot, sometimes a chunk of molasses candy he'd bought in town. He would leave the bucket by the fence post and walk away. For the first week, Kaiser wouldn't touch it until Arthur was back inside the house. Then, cautiously, he would approach, sniffing the air, before devouring the offering. The farmers who drove by on the dirt road would slow their trucks, shaking their heads. They saw an old man talking to a fence post, a fool wasting his time on a lost cause. They saw a monster that belonged in a can. They didn't see the tiny shifts, the subtle changes that Arthur saw. They didn't see the way Kaiser's pacing would slow, just for a moment, when Arthur started to hum. They didn't see the way his ears would swivel to catch the old man's gentle words. And they didn't see that Arthur wasn't just healing a bull. With every story he told, with every song he hummed, he was tending to the overgrown, lonely pasture of his own heart. Days bled into weeks, and the rhythm of their shared solitude became as predictable as the rising and setting of the sun. The worn path along the fence line grew deeper, a testament to Kaiser's lingering anxiety, but the frantic energy had begun to fade. The pacing was slower now, more thoughtful, less of a desperate escape and more of a contemplative walk. Arthur noticed everything. He saw the subtle softening around Kaiser's eyes, the way his tail, which had once been held rigid with aggression, would now occasionally give a soft, lazy flick. These were not grand gestures. They were whispers of change, quiet acknowledgments in their silent conversation. The true test, the first real crack in the bull's formidable armor, came on a cool autumn morning. A thick fog had settled over the valley, muffling the world in a blanket of gray. Arthur sat on his stool, his voice a low, comforting rumble in the mist. He was telling Kaiser about the time he and Martha had gotten their old truck stuck in the mud, how she had laughed so hard she'd cried while he'd cursed and slipped and slid. As he spoke, he pulled a particularly perfect apple from his pocket, red and gleaming with dew. Kaiser, who had been standing at the far end of the pasture, stopped his pacing. He turned his massive head, and for the first time, he didn't just look at Arthur. He seemed to be truly listening, his ears cupped forward, his body still. Arthur fell silent. The world held its breath. Then, slowly, deliberately, the great bull began to walk. He didn't charge. He didn't snort. He moved with a strange, hesitant grace, closing the distance between them. He stopped just on the other side of the wire, his head lowered, his warm breath creating a small cloud in the chilled air. His dark eyes met Arthur's. In them, the old man no longer saw a raging fire, but a deep, questioning stillness. There was fear, yes, but there was also a flicker of something else. Curiosity. Hope. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird in a fragile cage. He held his breath. This was the moment. This was the precipice. Kaiser stood there for a long minute, a statue carved from muscle and mist, before finally, gently, he nudged the bucket with his nose, a clear, unspoken request. He looked at Arthur, then back at the bucket. It was the first time he had ever acknowledged the offering while Arthur was still there. The first time he had bridged the gap with anything other than suspicion. A slow smile spread across Arthur's weathered face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. He tipped the bucket, and the apple rolled to the ground, right at the base of the fence. A small offering, across a vast divide. The day came when the fence was no longer enough. It had been a barrier of safety, but now it felt like a barrier to trust. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. Arthur had spent the morning humming, his voice stronger than usual, filled with a cautious optimism that felt both thrilling and terrifying. He'd watched as Kaiser ate the sweet feed from the bucket, his massive form relaxed, his presence a calm weight in the pasture rather than a storm. Today, Arthur did not bring his stool. He left the bucket by the gate, but he also brought something else, a single, perfect pear from the old tree behind his barn, Martha's favorite. He stood by the gate, his hand resting on the cool metal latch. Kaiser watched him, his gaze steady, unwavering. "Well, son," Arthur whispered more to himself than to the bull, "I reckon it's time." His hand trembled as he lifted the latch. The gate swung inward, with a soft groan, opening a path into the enclosure. He didn't step through. He simply stood in the opening, a frail old man in the doorway to a monster's den. He held out the pear, his palm flat, his arm outstretched. It was an offering of absolute vulnerability. 1,000 tons of muscle and a history of violence stood just feet away. A single flick of that powerful head, a single surge of remembered rage, and Arthur's story would be over. Have you ever stood on the edge of a decision so profound it feels like the whole world stops spinning, waiting for you to choose? Have you ever witnessed a wall, built of years of pain and fear, begin to crumble, brick by silent brick? That was this moment. Kaiser took a step back, his body tensing. The old instincts flared. A hand, outstretched, had always meant pain. A sharp sting from a cattle prod, a rough shove, a slap. His muscles bunched, ready to bolt, to fight, to retreat into the safety of his anger. Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't pull his hand back. He just stood there, his heart in his throat, his eyes soft with a plea that went beyond words. "It's all right," he murmured. "It's just me, Arthur." Kaiser stared at the hand, then at Arthur's face. He saw no threat. He saw no anger. He saw only patience, and the glistening, fragrant pear. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, then another. He stretched his neck, his wet nose twitching as he sniffed the offering. For a lifetime that lasted only 10 seconds, he hesitated. Then, with a touch as soft as velvet, his great, rough tongue swept across Arthur's palm, taking the pear. Arthur felt the wet, warm rasp against his skin, and a sob of pure, unadulterated relief caught in his chest. He had crossed the chasm. He was in. News travels fast in small towns, and the whispers about Crazy Arthur and his pet monster had become a source of local amusement and concern. Jed, the burly farmer who owned the adjacent property, had been hearing the stories for weeks. He'd heard Arthur singing to the beast, had seen him sitting by the fence for hours on end. He thought the old man had finally lost his grip, grief pushing him over the edge into dangerous sentimentality. One afternoon, Jed couldn't stand it anymore. He saw Arthur's truck parked by the pasture, but the old man was nowhere in sight. Fearing the worst, he grabbed a heavy wrench from his truck and marched over, his heart pounding with a mix of dread and frustration. He peered over the fence, expecting to see a tragic scene. What he saw made him stop dead in his tracks. The gate to the enclosure was wide open, and inside, not 10 feet from the most feared animal in the county, stood Arthur. He wasn't just in the pasture. He was brushing Kaiser's broad back with a long-handled grooming brush, his movements slow and rhythmic. The bull wasn't just tolerating it, he was leaning into it, his eyes half closed, in a state of bovine bliss. The scene was so peaceful, so utterly impossible, that Jed felt a dizzying sense of disbelief. "Arthur!" he yelled, his voice tight with alarm. "Get out of there! Have you lost your mind?" Kaiser's head shot up. A low rumble started in his chest, the old sound of warning. His body tensed, the gentle giant momentarily replaced by the defensive beast. But Arthur didn't panic. He simply placed a reassuring hand on the bull's massive shoulder. "Easy now, son. It's just Jed. He's a worrier," he said softly. To Jed, he called back, his voice calm and steady. "I'm all right, Jed. We're just having a visit." Jed stared, dumbfounded. The bull, this killer, was looking to frail Arthur for cues, for reassurance. He relaxed visibly under the old man's touch, the rumble in his chest subsiding into a gentle sigh. Jed lowered the wrench, his knuckles white. "But how?" he stammered, gesturing uselessly at the tranquil scene. "He was a demon. He nearly killed 2 men." Arthur stopped brushing and turned to face his neighbor. A gentle smile touched his lips, but his eyes were serious. He looked from Jed's stunned face to the calm, magnificent animal beside him. "He wasn't a demon, Jed," Arthur said, his voice carrying across the field. "He was just afraid. Turns out most demons are." He paused, giving Kaiser another affectionate pat. "I didn't do much. I just stopped giving him things to be afraid of." Jed simply stood there, leaning against the fence, the heavy wrench hanging forgotten in his hand. He was witnessing a miracle, a quiet testament to a kind of strength he had never understood. The fence that once defined their relationship now stood as a relic of a time long past. The boundary was gone, not just physically, but emotionally. Arthur's days now began not with a vigil at the fence line, but with a walk into the heart of the pasture. Kaiser would see him coming and greet him with a soft, low sound, a gentle rumble of welcome that was a world away from the furious bellows of their first encounter. Their companionship settled into a beautiful, unspoken language. It was a language of touch and trust. Arthur would spend hours grooming Kaiser, his brush untangling the knots in the thick, creamy coat, his hands checking for any cuts or scrapes. He would lean his frail back against Kaiser's solid, warm flank, while he read his morning paper, the bull standing perfectly still, a living, breathing wall of protection and peace. He discovered the spot just behind Kaiser's ears that made his eyes close and his head droop with pleasure. In return, Kaiser learned Arthur. He learned the sound of Arthur's shuffling footsteps, the particular cadence of his hums, the gentle authority in his soft-spoken words. When Arthur's arthritis was particularly bad, causing him to move slowly and painfully, Kaiser seemed to sense it, walking at a snail's pace beside him, nudging him gently with his great head as if to offer support. Their connection was a mirror. In Kaiser, Arthur had found a vessel for the boundless affection he still held for his wife, a purpose that filled the hollow ache of his lonely farmhouse. And in Arthur, Kaiser had found the one thing his life of pain and fear had denied him, a safe harbor. He had learned that a hand could offer a soft scratch behind the ears, not just a sharp blow. He had learned that a voice could soothe, not just command. He had learned that a human heart could be a place of refuge, not a source of terror. One afternoon, as a warm sun dipped towards the horizon, Arthur sat on a hay bale, watching Kaiser graze peacefully. The setting sun cast them both in a golden light, 2 figures, one large and one small, existing in perfect harmony. It wasn't about ownership, it was about kinship. Arthur hadn't broken the bull's spirit, he had unearthed it. He had chipped away the layers of fear and rage, not with force, but with a patient, relentless kindness, until the gentle soul beneath was finally free to emerge. The sky had been a deceptive blue all day, but by late afternoon it turned a bruised, angry purple. A summer storm, vicious and sudden, rolled over the hills. The wind rose to a howl, whipping the trees into a frenzy and tearing at the roof of the old barn. Then came the rain, a torrential downpour, followed by cracks of thunder so loud they seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. For any other farmer, this would be a moment of anxiety for their livestock. For Arthur, it was a moment of pure dread. This was the ultimate test. Loud noises, sudden flashes of light, the chaos of a storm, these were the triggers that had once sent Kaiser into a destructive, blind panic. Arthur's heart pounded as a particularly violent clap of thunder echoed through the valley. He imagined Kaiser, alone in the pasture, terrorized and reverting to the primal fear that had defined him for so long. He imagined him charging through fences, a ton of terrified muscle, lost and dangerous. He couldn't leave him out there alone. Pulling on his old raincoat, Arthur fought his way through the wind and rain. His frail body braced against the gale. He stumbled into the pasture, calling Kaiser's name, his voice nearly stolen by the wind. He found him not by the fence, but standing in the open, his massive frame trembling, his head swiveling wildly with every flash of lightning. Fear was rolling off him in waves. As Arthur approached, Kaiser let out a low, distressed bellow. The old, dangerous energy was there, simmering just below the surface. Arthur's instinct screamed at him to back away, to seek shelter. But he ignored it. He walked forward, his steps uncertain on the slick mud, until he was standing right in front of the terrified bull. "It's all right, son," Arthur shouted over the storm, his voice full of a conviction he didn't entirely feel. "It's just noise. It'll pass." He reached out a trembling hand and laid it on Kaiser's wet, shaking neck. For a second, the bull flinched, his muscles coiling. But then, as another clap of thunder ripped the sky apart, something extraordinary happened. Instead of bolting, instead of fighting, Kaiser leaned into Arthur's touch. He lowered his great head and pushed it gently against Arthur's chest, seeking comfort from the only source of safety he had ever known. And so they stood, a frail old man and a giant bull, in the heart of the storm. The beast that everyone feared was finding solace not in his own immense power, but in the steadfast presence of his friend, a tiny, unshakable anchor in a world of chaos. The story of Arthur and Kaiser had become something of a local legend, a piece of folklore whispered over coffee at the town diner and discussed over fence posts between farms. Some still called it a fluke, others a miracle. Arthur knew it was neither. It was simply a relationship. But he also knew that for people to truly understand, they had to see it. The annual county fair was approaching, a bustling hub of noise, crowds, and competition. It was the last place on earth anyone would think to bring an animal like Kaiser. But that's exactly what Arthur decided to do. He wasn't entering Kaiser in any competition. There would be no judging of his muscle or conformation. The prize was already won. This was to be a demonstration not of strength, but of spirit. The day of the fair, Arthur simply clipped a soft rope halter onto Kaiser's head and led him from the trailer. A wave of hushed shock, then outright panic, rippled through the crowd as they saw the infamous bull, the $1 monster, walking calmly through the fairgrounds. People backed away, pulling their children close. Security guards started moving forward, their faces grim. But Kaiser didn't even seem to notice them. His world had shrunk to the old man walking beside him. His eyes were fixed on Arthur, his steps slow and measured to match his friend's shuffling gait. He walked past the flashing lights of the midway, past the shouting vendors and screaming children, a sea of calm and an ocean of chaos. Arthur led him to a small, grassy patch and simply stopped. He didn't tie Kaiser to anything. He just dropped the rope on the ground and sat down on a nearby bench, and Kaiser stood beside him, patient and serene. People watched from a distance, mesmerized. Then, a little girl, no older than 5, broke away from her mother's grasp. With the innocent fearlessness of a child, she walked right up to the giant bull. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Her mother cried out in terror, but before anyone could move, Kaiser lowered his massive head down to her level. The little girl reached out a tentative hand and stroked his wet nose. Kaiser didn't move a muscle. He just closed his eyes, accepting the touch with a soft, gentle sigh. The silence that followed was profound. In that moment, he wasn't a beast, or a monster, or a dollar store tragedy. He was just Kaiser, a gentle soul who had been taught how to be loved. The setting sun painted the fields in hues of gold and fire, a quiet, breathtaking end to the day. Arthur sat on his porch steps, a cup of tea warming his gnarled hands. In the pasture before him, Kaiser grazed peacefully, his massive white form almost glowing in the fading light. The fence between them was still there, a simple line of wire and wood, but it no longer felt like a barrier. Now, it was just part of the landscape, like the old oak tree or the rolling hills beyond. It was a reminder not of separation, but of how far they had come. Their story had changed the farm, it had changed the town, and it had changed Arthur. The cranky, solitary old man was gone. In his place was a man with a quiet smile and a deep well of peace in his eyes. People came by sometimes, strangers who had heard the tale. They'd stand at the edge of the property, hoping to catch a glimpse of the miracle bull. Arthur never preached or gave speeches. He'd just invite them to sit with him for a while and watch. He let the quiet companionship of man and beast speak for itself. He knew the truth was simple. He hadn't performed a miracle. He hadn't tamed a monster. He had simply looked at a creature drowning in fear and refused to believe that fear was all it was. He had offered patience when the world offered judgment. He had offered kindness when the world offered force. He had seen a soul worth saving inside a body everyone else had thrown away. As twilight deepened, Kaiser finished grazing and ambled over to the porch. He rested his great head on the railing, his warm breath ghosting across Arthur's arm. Arthur reached out and stroked the familiar, coarse hair between his eyes. This was the payoff. Not the shocked faces at the fair, not the vindication against the naysayers, but this quiet moment, this unspoken understanding, this profound and simple peace. It was never about breaking a bull's spirit. It was about creating a space safe enough for that spirit to finally heal, proving that the most powerful force on earth isn't strength or dominance, but a compassion that is brave enough to see the good in something everyone else has deemed broken.